We'll go to the next slide. So here is the Great Wall of China that I was talking about. It is very extensive, very large. It was maintained very well by subsequent rulers. In fact, at some point of time, the Mongolian tribes and the Manchurian tribes came to this part, but they still wanted to maintain this wall because they want to keep the other tribal people away. So that's how it is. So this is a map of the Silk Road. The Silk Road is about how the trade relations happened between India and China and the rest of the old world. So obviously this started all the way from Bengal in modern day Bangladesh. In modern day Bangladesh was known for its cotton cultivation and its clothes, especially the muslin cloth. So the muslin cloth had its origin in Bangladesh, but it is named after a place called Mosul in Iran. Because the Europeans thought that it originated there. So that generally happens with many of the names. The Europeans name according to where they are getting the thing from. Iran was a hot trading spot. It was like the middle spot between the rich resources of India and China and the people who wanted these resources, that is Europe and Turkey. So that was one thing. So it started all the way from Bangladesh, and this was a meeting point. We have so many different names here which you might be aware of. You have Tashkent, which is the capital city of one of the countries in Central Asia now. You have Samarkand, Kashgar, Taxila. So Taxila is the place where an old university, a very famous university, existed in ancient India. It was a spot where people from so many different empires came together to learn philosophy and religion and all that. Kabul in Afghanistan was also an important part of this trade route. So the Silk Road is only, the word mentioned here is Silk Road. So this is clearly the way in which the trade happened through the land. But there were also other ways. The other way was, you come all the way from here, come to Malaysia, come to Myanmar, and then you take the sea route, you go to Bengal, you come all the way to India, and then you take it from here, you go to other parts of Europe through the sea route. So the sea route existed, the land route existed. It was very, very important to have trade relationship between India and the rest of the world. So that was about the Silk Route. We'll talk about the different contributions. So in this page, we'll try to understand what was actually traded and what India and China contributed as civilizations. Talking about India first, India's metallurgy was extremely famous. To give you an example, at one point that Greece had contact with India. Alexander the Great, he came all the way to India and he conquered Persia. He had suzerainty and imperialism over Persia. He wanted to take parts of India also, but his soldiers refused because they were afraid after seeing a particular chieftain, a border chieftain, fighting so fiercely with elephants and all. So Alexander and the Indian Empire had the Mauryan Empire at that time had some sort of a contact, and when Alexander was short of steel, he wanted steel and swords to come from India. So that is the level of quality that we had. So you will also remember the example of the Iron Pillar in Delhi. That is a pillar which is not really, it's not really rusting. So that is a miracle. So and that is the level of our metallurgy techniques. We also invented diamond cutting and polishing. We were very good with mining gems and minerals. So diamond was one of those. And diamond cutting and polishing was not established anywhere else. If you have a diamond, you can cut it only with a diamond because it is one of the hardest natural substances. So that is there. And then India was also very good with mining and gemstones. So gems were so abundant in our country that if you see Akbar's ministers, they were called Navaratnas. So Ratna was a very common word. It was very famous in our country. Interestingly, we also invented the shampoo. Shampoo is something that every part of the world uses now. The word itself is derived from the Hindi Sanskrit word. The word is champu in Hindi, if I am not wrong. So that is shampoo. We also invented games. We invented chess, chaturanga, in the form of chaturanga. We invented ludo. We invented snake and ladders. So all these games, they were taken to Persia naturally, and from Persia they went on to Europe, and Europe took it up. Related to clothes, we invented a lot of things. We invented button, we invented chins, muslin, jute and indigo. So jute and indigo cultivation was not done in most parts of the world. India was one of the first countries to start cotton cultivation, and they were very good with manufacturing clothes. Europeans were not really good with that. So India exported a lot of clothes, cotton, jute, indigo and all that. We also have contribution of India in the system of medicine. So you would remember plastic surgery for the name Shushruta. Shushruta was a person who at least 2000 years ago had demonstrated his skills in surgery. Then you also have Ayurvedic and Siddha systems of medicine. So this is mentioned in multiple circumstances. This is so extensive now that the government of India decided to have an entire ministry for it, the Ayush ministry. So this is about the traditional system of medicine where the people of India knew about different plants, different resources, and what those resources could do to the human body. So that was based on extensive exploration. So Ayurvedic and Siddha systems of medicine was contributed. Languages, Sanskrit grammar is one of the most complicated and very beautifully structured. It is supposed to be the most beautifully structured grammar of any languages. So Sanskrit grammar was very, very famous. So it was one of the first languages to have a structured grammar, not any other language. You might think of English, you might think of Hindi, but it started with Sanskrit. India also has huge linguistic diversity. In China, linguistic diversity is there, but not to the extent of India. We had so many different languages, and to the extent that we were so good with languages, to the extent that we have contributed two classical languages from our side to the world. So one classical language is Sanskrit and the other classical language is Tamil. So based on these two languages, many different languages came up. A lot of different dialects are there. So that is about Indian contribution to the world. If you take China's contribution to the world, probably 2 or 3 slides won't be enough to cover all the aspects, if you believe the Wikipedia page of their list of inventions and discoveries. But some discoveries and inventions were very, very prominent. For example, paper and printing technique, as I mentioned before, they were done in China, and paper currency was also invented in China. So before that, people had to painfully carry coins. So they used to make copper coins, they used to make gold and silver coins. So money as a currency, they had to painfully take it. That was a lot of weight. So people thought, why not use paper as a currency? They printed paper and then they used it as a currency for the first time. So in the same class here, so gunpowder, bombs and firecrackers, they are in the same class here. It all started with the creation of gunpowder. Firecracker is not really part of gunpowder. It was not using chemicals as such. It was using bamboo. So if you heat bamboo beyond a particular extent, it will simply burst. So firecrackers were invented in China, and it was usually done to ward off evil spirits. So that is the reason for why they used it. China also invented compass in a proper way, but compass is something that people have invented time and again in different civilizations. Compass was also discovered, the idea was also discovered in Europe, and people used it to some extent, but it was properly done during the Song dynasty in the civilization of China. Rice cultivation and millets. So rice, we don't know for sure if rice cultivation is done from one particular spot alone, but it was so extensively done in ancient China, even before all the civilization existed. So rice cultivation, millet cultivation also sort of started in China. We also have, just like we have Ayurveda and Siddha systems of medicine, we also have acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine. Traditional Chinese medicine is similar to our Ayurvedic system, Siddha system. So acupuncture is also there. So the Chinese people were very proud of their acupuncture. In fact, Huanzang, when he came to India, he talked about Indian system of medicine, but he said it's not comparative to the Chinese system of medicine. The Chinese people also invented significant number of things in the field of mechanical engineering. The most important one being bellows. They are used in processing metals, in processing ores and converting them into metal. And they invented significantly the belt drives and the chain drives. This was not done in Europe. This was invented in China to for mass production sake. In some sort of mass production was done. For that, belt drives and chain drives were first used. China also claims to invent the Chinese civil service examination. To some extent, it makes sense because Chinese empire was so huge and there was only one kingdom, one emperor, that you had to have some sort of a system to appoint officials to different places. So they had a central institute or some regional institute where different people were trained. But before the training, people had to write some exam. So that was invented in China. Most famous part of China is sericulture and porcelain. Sericulture relates to silk. So silk was extremely famous from China. They exported it throughout their existence, from the very ancient times till the modern period. They exported to rest of the world. So that is sericulture. Porcelain is again so famous that when you go to the European country, it is not even called porcelain, they simply call it the China. So that is porcelain, cutlery and all that, they were very good. So this probably these two gave Chinese economy a lot of money than anything else. So these were the contributions of India and China. Yeah, so we'll take this one particular slide. It's a small module which talks about modern history, modern Indian history in its entirety. So we'll start, the modern history is set to start with the death of Aurangzeb. So Aurangzeb was a person who ruled India. He was part of the Mughal Empire. He ruled India very extensively. He did not have very favorable policies. Some of his policies were hostile towards other sections of the people. Like he was not very hostile, not very good with Hindu people, for example. So after the death of Aurangzeb, he was a very powerful ruler. After his death, there was a lot of factional war. Many local leaders wanted to have their own control. So Bengal immediately got its own independence in 1817 after Aurangzeb. There were many internal wars. At the same time, you also had the Marathas and Rajputs. Now that the Mughals finally perished, they wanted to have their share. So they expanded their things, and the Marathas were eventually only crushed by the British people in late 1800s. So that was a thing. I'm sorry if I mentioned it wrong. Aurangzeb died in 1707 and Bengal became a new independent state in 1717. So that was the thing. And by this time, from 1498, Vasco da Gama came to India. From that time, Portuguese people established trading posts in our country. For about 120 years, there was no other country interested in establishing a trading post. But slowly, after the 1600, British people and the French people joined. They established a lot of trading posts. But after establishing, they wanted a particular town. For example, Chennai was, originally purchased from a local ruler. Chennai was a small town, originally purchased by the British from the local ruler. So they established a fort in Chennai, and they wanted to hold on to the fort. The similar thing happened with Mumbai also. Mumbai is a city which was actually given to the British as a dowry by the Portuguese, because a Portuguese princess actually married a British prince, and then Mumbai was a part which was given as a dowry to the British. So they had a lot of trading posts. They established their city and they wanted to have a stronghold. So fortifications were done in many places. In some places, the local rulers objected, especially in Bengal, in Kolkata. The local ruler who was there at that time, he objected to the fortification thing, and he tried to bring his army to do the fortification. But then the British people, they were crushed. Initially they were crushed and a lot of British people died, but they sent for reinforcements. At that time you had Chennai, in Madras there were some some British people. So they went as reinforcements all the way to Kolkata, and then eventually the local ruler there in Bengal, he was crushed. And after getting crushed, they crushed with the help of other ruler. There was there was an army general within that independent state who had his own ambitions. So they had a deal with him. They corrupted people, they bribed people, and then eventually the local ruler was defeated. But that empire was just so huge. Bengal was a very huge place. So for the first time, the ordinary traders in this country, ordinary traders who came to this country, they were in possession of a very large territory. So they left the administration to the local ruler or their puppet ruler, and then they extracted as many taxes from the people as possible. They traded everything without giving any money to anyone. So that was how they started out. It all started in Bengal. And in rest of the other parts of the country, they demanded more rights and powers. So that was also one thing. Corruption and bribery was one major way in which they did things. They also used modern powerful elements like use of guns, because guns were not existing in India. The Indian people were fighting with swords. So even the first war between Bengal and the British troops, it was like swords on one side with a large population, and the British people simply had guns. They could easily kill a lot of people. So they used modern technology to assert their power. That's what they did. And then they over a period of 100 years they annexed a lot of different territories, by war. So basically it happened by war. So initially they conquered Bengal, they conquered parts of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, and then eventually by 1800s they even reached Delhi and they were in possession of Delhi. Delhi was the seat of Mughal rule. People of India still felt that they were subjects of the Mughal Empire, even though it was only restricted to Delhi. But still, Delhi was very important and symbolic, and the British people were able to get control of that. There was also this concept of doctrine of lapse. So they used very unfair and very coercive means to get power. So if there is any local ruler who is not having a male hire, then the British people will simply take away their land, saying that your kingdom is not really capable, so we are taking it away. So deceit is something that they used very often. They put one ruler against the other. They supported one secretly, and then they were able to get things done. Systematic subjugation started from there on. Systematic subjugation would mean they tried to reduce the influence of religion. For example, they completely tried to remove the religious education centers. So whether it was Muslim education centers or Hindu education centers, they were completely removed, they were banned. And then they tried to bring in the English education system. They thought the people getting educated in English would mean that they would forget their own culture, they would forget their own identity. So that was systemic subjugation. Other very important aspect which they continued to do throughout their existence was to pit one religion against the other. They would pit especially Hindus against the Muslims, and that is the way in which they were preventing the Indians from coming together against them. So that is systematic subjugation. Great Revolt of 1857, it happened for multiple reasons. The soldiers were treated unfairly. They saw their own homeland being annexed by British people in unfair ways, and the people were in general, they were economically very downtrodden. So the Great Revolt happened as a simultaneous thing. It initially started with Sepoy mutiny, the soldiers mutinied, but so many other people came together. But the Great Revolt did not really succeed. It did not have the full backing of the people of India, because in some parts of the country there were landlords and chieftains who were installed by the British people. So for example, if you're in a district, in that district there is a powerful landlord who had an appeal with the people, and if that landlord was installed by the British people, then obviously he'd be subservient to the British rule. So those landlords, they selfishly thought, okay, under the British people I'm getting a lot of money, now I have at least a system of being a zamindar, but before I did not have that. So they were complicit. They were okay with their people being subjugated by the British people. So it was not a completely united movement, but it was very significant nevertheless. So that was a Great Revolt of 1857. Now one significant point here is, till 1857, right from 1730s till 1857, the British rule over India was not based on the official United Kingdom. It was based on simply the East India Company. That's it. So the East India Company, it was a collection of traders. It was a collection of people who had their own system. They simply wanted to exploit India. They simply wanted to take economic benefits out of India. So they traded. But after the Great Revolt, the British Kingdom, they came together. They decided that this cannot go on. Now we will take this entire country in our own hands, and they took over the thing. Introduction of technologies. So this basically happened not because the British people were sympathetic to our country and wanted our betterment. They wanted to better their efficiency in extracting resources out of India. For example, they constructed railways. The railways was for swift movement of troops to different parts of the country to swiftly reduce any sort of rebellion. At the same time, railways was also constructed for the sake of transportation of goods. For example, you had coal and other resources in central part of India. You want to transport that to the coastal region and then eventually take it by sea to your own country. So that is the reason for why they introduced technologies in our country. There is also this concept of drain of wealth and economic starvation. This is something that they did. It involved destabilizing our own industries. For example, our cottage industry, our industry of producing clothes. So these were completely destabilized. People are not really allowed to produce any sort of material. Especially, they were not allowed to sell clothes and make clothes. What they did was they took the raw material out of our country. for an extremely low price, for an abysmal price, and then they took it to their country. In their country, because of industrial revolution in the 1830s, they had extremely efficient cotton mills. So with those cotton mills, they were able to produce a lot of clothes, and the clothes were taken back to India, and then the people were sold clothes based on that. So Indian economy was systematically starved by the British people step by step. So, and then drain of wealth eventually happened. So drain of wealth is this concept where eventually if two countries are supposed to be equal, then if India was the major exporter here. In the initial period, UK was not really exporting anything to our country. So India was exporting some stuff. For that, India needed payment, and a lot of gold was flowing from UK and other European powers to India. So India was a large accumulation of gold and currency at that point of time. But after the British people were ambitious, they gained control of territory. They did not really pay gold for them. Whatever they wanted, they simply took away, saying some small excuse, or sometimes without even an excuse. So that was a concept of drain of wealth. At this time, there was also this social and cultural reform that happened continuously. So there were many leaders who were intellectuals. Raja Ram Mohan Roy, for example, was one person. He started this reform movement of religion and culture even before 1857 revolt. There were so many other people who started social and cultural reform. People were against the caste system. People were against systems where women were subjugated. People were against so many religious practices. So these reform movements took place, and many of them were successful. And the success of the reform movement can partially be attributed to better communication technologies. We had the printing introduced by the British people to our country, and then printing press were quickly taken up by a lot of intellectuals. If you take a look at many newspapers in our country, for example, the Times of India or the Hindu, they all started during this period from 1860s and 1870s. Hindu was started in 1878, for example. So at this point of time, newspapers were a thing, and magazines and all, they were very popular, and many people also became literate. They were able to start reading. Some newspapers and magazines were published in English, some were published in vernacular. Vernacular was a sort of thing in which people were mobilized because the people knew their own language. The mobilization of people and the slow transformation of what people think, that happened through that. So at this time also, so after this particular period, you would also remember great people like Swami Vivekananda, for example. He went all the way to USA to preach his version of India, his version of religion and all that. So this was based on the reform movement undertaken by a lot of leaders initially. We also have the rise of nationalist movements after some time. After 1800s and 1900s, the nationalist movement was started, and people were actively mobilizing against the British people. They wanted a non-violent movement. Initially, they thought we will cooperate with the British people, and eventually the British people will gain us autonomy and everything. But that really didn't work out. And after you had different groups here, you had some moderates, you had some radicals. The moderates thought that we will cooperate with the British, we will slowly try to convince them and give us what we want. The radicals thought that the British people can't really be convinced, we have to take things in our own hands, we have to do some military act and get things done, we have to protest violently and all that. So that was the thinking of radicals. When Gandhi came over, Gandhi appealed to people because he was working very close to people. The moderates and the radicals, they were working things out based on the Congress. The Congress was started in 1885 by a British person to organize different groups. Eventually that turned out to be a very big movement. In Congress, it was still elitist. Only people who are very well educated, they thought about all these things. But Gandhi, when he came together, he went down to earth, he went to the people, he went to very poor villages, he talked to them, and then he tried to use the non-violent movement, the Ahimsa movement, to get what they wanted. So his movement happened in Champaran, so Champaran Satyagraha, Kera Satyagraha. So all these things were very significant. So Gandhi was very popular, rapidly becoming popular. He also got a lot of influence in the Indian National Congress after some time. So there were many other leaders involved in the process also. It was not just one person who was doing everything. There were, like I said, there were people who were people like Gandhi who wanted non-violent movement. There were people like moderates who wanted to convince British people to give more autonomy to them. There were people like Nehru who were very intellectual. They exposed British intentions very systematically and very beautifully. And you had radicals. Radicals would involve, in early stages of radicals was one thing, but you also have had Bhagat Singh, for example. You had Subhash Chandra Bose. Subhash Chandra Bose went to the extent of taking help from Japan, and he established his own version of the Indian Army initially in Malaysia. So that was how things worked out with the Indian history. We'll talk shortly about the Chinese history. The Chinese history, initially the Qing conquest of Ming. So if you remember, the Qing Empire was the one which consolidated many parts of China all the way from Manchuria to Tibet. So it brought China to its proper the present day proper form. So that was a result of a Manchurian invasion, the second time China proper was ruled. And this was clearly one of the largest empires ever in terms of area and also in terms of population, resources, the GDP that it contributed to the entire world. In 1800s, it was simply the largest. One third of the world's population was governed by this particular empire. Initially, for China, external influence came from British trading posts. So British trading posts were established after their control of India. The British people first, they gained a stronghold over India. And then there was a massive trade imbalance. British people wanted a lot of goods from China, for example, silk and porcelain and tea. So tea was very famous from China. So the trade imbalance between British people and the Chinese people was very high. British silver was going to China in large numbers. So the British people came up with an idea. They said, we will use our colony in India to grow opium. That is a drug. So we will use that drug, we will make the Chinese people drug addicts, and then we will reduce their economic power, we will start a war and then slowly win over. So the British people, when they established their trading posts in parts of China, they introduced opium there. Opium was initially tolerated, but after some time it was made illegal. But in spite of being made illegal, the British people daringly sold it to the Chinese people. By this time, a large number of Chinese citizens were addicts to opium, and that was a huge problem. So with that, a war started between the Qing dynasty and then the British people, in which obviously the British people won because of superior technology. And then the Qing Empire had to give permanent permanent trading permission for the British people. They also had to give some areas, for example, Hong Kong and Taiwan, they were given to the British people at that time. So this was a typing revolution, just like in Mughal region. When the Mughal region was at its peak after the death of Aurangzeb, a lot of internal revolution existed. A lot of people wanted to have control of power. So this is something similar. Qing Empire is like the Mughal Empire of China, and then this was an internal revolution. Let's think of this as something similar to the Marathas. So they had a revolution and they were very successful. They ended up controlling about 1/3 of China. But they were put down. The Qing dynasty survived, but that was a severe blow, because they were not strong enough now to resist the foreign forces. So by the time many independent rulers in different provinces came up, just like it happened in India during the same timeline. So that is how it worked. Most significant thing here is the rivalry between China and Japan. So Japanese insecurity over Korea. That is the reference to, Korea is a sort of a peninsula that extends between China, that is between China and Japan. So China and Japan, so Chinese people initially, culturally they used to think of Japan as something, subjugated to China. But Japan was, rapidly getting industrialized in the 1840s and 50s, and they were gaining their military and economic strength. So Japan was still kind of insecure about Korea. They thought if China has a lot of influence over Korea, then they can use that as an attack, use that as a thing to attack Japan. And then you had a lot of internal riots in Korea, for example. The problem between Japan and China, it started with internal riots in Korea. Japan clearly wanted to have some sort of a control over Korea now that it was getting industrially developed. China also wanted to have some sort of influence, but Korea was just extremely backward. The backward nature of Korea prompted some soldiers to start some revolt. So in that revolt, both Japan and China, they sent the Qing dynasty of China and the Japanese Empire, they sent their forces to reduce the thing. In that, the Chinese forces eventually, they were able to gain a lot of control in that particular incident. And then you also had this incident of Nagasaki, where some Chinese traders, they went to Japan, they had their port, and in their trading port they started a lot of problems, and many local Japanese people were killed. So from this time on, the Japanese people did not really trust China. They were kind of becoming anti-China. There was this other incident, for example. Now there are many incidents. These are just some examples that I'm citing. There was this other incident where a Korean leader who was pro-Japanese was assassinated in a part of China, that is Shanghai. So this again cemented the hatred of China for Japan, and then it eventually, after that, it started with the first Indo-Japan war. In that first Indo-Japan war, China lost. China thought of itself as a country which could easily crush Japan, but Japan was industrially advanced. China also had some good techniques. They had a good navy, but they were not able to suppress Japan. Japan ended up occupying Korea after this war, and then they had to give way to Taiwan, Korea, and the Liaodong Peninsula was ceded to Japan, and reparations had to be paid by China. So it was a period of intense humiliation for the Chinese people, because the amount of money that Japan demanded for reparations was more than the revenue of the Chinese Qing dynasty per year. So that was a period of intense humiliation. China suffered economically because of the loss. There was also this Boxer uprising. The Chinese people no longer tolerated this. By this time, Christian missionaries were there in China. By this time, Japan had some sort of an influence. The traditional Chinese people, they thought this is more than enough. We don't want anything like this to happen. So there was an uprising, and they killed all sorts of foreigners who existed. So Christian missionaries in China, they were killed. And there were also other people who were pro-Japanese, other people who were pro-Western powers. They were also immediately killed. So during this Boxer uprising, the Christian people were killed. So many European powers, an alliance of about 6 countries, they came together and said, this is not acceptable. We want to punish China for this. So they came all the way and they defeated China. So it took them 2 attempts to defeat China. And after defeating China, again reparations were demanded. A lot of money was demanded from China. So China was suffering a lot. It was not economically good. At that point of time, people thought the Qing dynasty is really useless. It is not doing anything to strengthen the country against foreign powers. It is not doing anything to bring up economic welfare for the people. So that was about the repercussion of this. After that, many student leaders started to think that China could give away with monarchy totally. And then they proclaimed China to be the Republic of China in 1912. So in 1912, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, his movement and a lot of other people came together and they said China will from now on be a republic. But there was some resistance to that. The people who wanted dynasty, wanted monarchy to continue, they did not really accept it. There was one army general who took things in his own hands and he instilled an empire for a short amount of time. So from 1912 to 1915, this particular army general was ruling the country. The people who wanted reforms, they had to wait for some amount of time. So after that, World War I happened. World War I was a distraction for all the other European powers. At this point, Japan was trying to consolidate. There were 2 major parties coming out here. 2 major schools of thought about how China needs to progress. One school of thought was obviously this Kuomintang school of thought, and the other one was the communist. So Kuomintang is the Chinese word for the nationalist party. So there were 2 groups, the nationalists and the communists. The nationalists wanted China to develop a sense of nationalism and they wanted to establish the country as a democracy. But the communist people had heavy influence from Russia and other revolutionary movements in Europe. So what communism really means, we'll take a slight detour and understand that. Communism means that all the property of a particular country is supposed to be owned by the community. So only the community will own it, they will exercise control, and you having control of an individual having something will depend on his ability, about how much he has contributed to the community. So everything will be owned by the community, nothing is a private property. So that is the basic thing about communists. But the nationalists were not like that. They were advocates of democracy, they were advocates of capitalism, free market and all that. So these 2 major groups existed at that point of time. So from 1927, the rivalry between these two groups had come to a boiling point. They started a war. They had a war with each other. Each group tried to control the other. So it was kind of a civil war in China from 1927 till 1937. In 1937, what happened in China was a second war with Japan. So the rivalry between the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party was very intense, but the threat from Japan was so huge that they had to come together to defeat the Japanese people. Japanese people were not easy to defeat. They were so powerful by that time that they controlled parts of China. So we are talking about the timeline of 1938 to 1945. So by that time, Japan controlled lots of parts of China. It controlled Indonesia, it controlled Malaysia, it controlled many islands near Australia. It came all the way till Northeast India. It came all the way till Assam. So our people in Assam, they had actually fought against the Japanese people. That was the extent of Japan. That was the ruthlessness of Japanese invasion. So that was one thing, but Japan was eventually defeated in 1945 after the Second World War ended. The Hiroshima Nagasaki bombing by US and then the prolonged war by US forces with Japan. It surrendered, and then the civil war continued for another 4 years. The Communist Party was so ruthless and efficient that they were able to crush the Nationalist Party. The mainland China was completely covered by the communists, and the Nationalist Party was restricted to simply 1 or 2 islands. The most prominent of that island is Taiwan. So even now, Taiwan is a place in China which is not having a direct relationship. It is kind of neither a country nor a proper territory, kind of a place. So that is about the short history of China, short modern history of China. So we'll wrap things up. This has been a very long video. We'll wrap things up finally. We are basically trying to understand just about everything that we have talked about. What is the position of India and China just after their independence, how they started out and how they have come to the place that they are now. So China, we'll start with China. China was a very strong and large country with a vast population and resources. At that time, you know that Qing dynasty had the very large border area. So that border area was maintained after the loss of Japan in the World War II. Japan was forced to go back to its original island, and China was back to its full strength. So the population of China was extremely large at the time. So in 1950, the communists won and they declared themselves to be the People's Republic of China. So after 1950, the population was very strong. A lot of resources existed in China. You had coal, you had iron, you had resources to a lot of other metals. You had fertile plains for your agriculture. You had just about everything. You had water from the Tibetan region coming to the fertile plains. You had all resources. But the country was war torn. The country was not really in a good situation because it had recently fought a brutal war with Japan. Millions of lives of the Chinese people were lost in the war. So initially they simply wanted to come to the pre-war economy level. They wanted to take things back to normal. They wanted to rebuild many buildings, and they wanted to have all these things. So major point here is that they were a communist, it had a communist leadership. So communist leadership is clearly because there was a heavy influence of Russia. Russia was a socialist state by that time under Stalin. Communism is not very different from socialism. Socialism means that there will be a central authority which will control everything. In communism, for both communism and socialism, the hatred for capitalism is the same. So for socialism, a central authority will be there. The community will own just about everything. So the influence of Russia was very heavy, and there was also dictatorial tendency. To give you an example, the people in Tibet were very peaceful people who were very happy with their nomadic life and with their religion. When China gained control of the entire territory, they wanted to build a modern country. They created a lot of problems in what is now modern day Tibet. And a lot of Tibetan people were forcibly taken away and made to work in other regions. For example, they wanted to produce a lot of coal. They wanted to produce a lot of iron. So they were forcibly taken away. And China was also, acknowledged by the Western powers as one of the victors of World War II because it actually fought the war. India did not actually fight the war. China had actually, had the experience of fighting the war. So that was about the victory of World War II. And because it gained victory, it was granted very high position in the UNSC. So that was about China. About India, it was struggling with partition. A large number of princely states existed. Partition was, the work of the British people. They wanted to separate India and Pakistan. It was also the work of many Muslim leaders. They demanded that a new country should be given to them because they felt very insecure being a minority in a Hindu country. So India was very struggling with partition. India and Pakistan had constant war based on Jammu and Kashmir and also in Bengal. And there were a large number of princely states. Princely states mean that they were independent kingdoms, very small, isolated independent kingdoms ruled by some sort of a leader, some sort of a king. So there are more than 500 princely states are said to exist in India immediately after independence. So the leaders of India undertook a lot of effort to bring together those princely states, so that consolidation was happening. The leaders were committed to a democratic republic. This was because extensively debated from 1930s. The Indian National Congress debated what sort of a country India has to be. So they clearly said that the will of the people, especially for a country like India with very diverse population, the will of the people should be like a cooperative federalism sort of thing. They wanted it to be democratic. They wanted it to be a republic. They wanted nothing to do with any monarchy or anything of that sort. So they were committed to democratic republic right from 1930s, and it was solidly implemented in 1950 with the introduction of the Indian Constitution. So India was still looked down upon by European powers, basically because British people were actually controlling India. So they know that Indian people, they had some sort of resentment that they had to leave India. India was also extremely poor. The poverty of India was so bad. So just about everyone in the world knew that India is synonymous with poverty. So India was looked down upon by European powers. It was not granted any high position in UNSC like it was granted for China. And then there was slight influence of Russia initially because Mr. Nehru was the Prime Minister of independent India. And Mr. Nehru strongly admired the Russian system, the Russian socialist system. So he wanted to build India along those lines. He wanted to construct big projects. He wanted state entities to work in strategic sectors. So there was a slight influence in Russia. India frequently collaborated with Russia to establish its industries in the initial stage. India was also committed to being non-aligned. Even though there was this slight influence of Russia, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru made it very clear that we don't want to support any other country unconditionally. We will support or not support any country solely based on the particular issue. So India was neither leaning towards the USA nor leaning towards Russia, because at that time there was a Cold War brewing between USA and Russia. So there was this extreme poverty, like I mentioned before, and there was also India was also struggling with poor policies from British era. The most famous example was land reform. Under the British era, the land was divided randomly and it was given to a few people. Most of the people were landless. They had no resource. They had nothing to go on. So the Indian Prime Minister and the Indian Constitution and also so many other Indian leaders, they simply wanted to do this land reform. They wanted to give land to a lot of people so that they will have some sort of a livelihood. So this zamindari system was looked down upon in independent India. So that was one example. There was also this other example of not consolidating anything. Nothing was consolidated in our country, education system or the transportation system, communication, nothing was consolidated. So all these things were put together, had to be put together by our country. So if you look at this, it seems as if China was slightly at an advantage overall. This has been a long session of history between China and India. The basic point here is that India and China started very similarly. They are both very huge countries which had significant contribution to the rest of the world. They started similarly. The way they progressed, the number of dynasties they had, everything is very similar. Around the same time period in history, they had contacts with each other. Around the same time period, they flourished. Around the same time period, they were under the influence of foreign powers. At the end of the day, China chose to embrace the communist system, and they were slightly at an edge because they were away from all the influence of colonialism. And India was under the influence of colonialism. It was completely ravaged. We had to pick ourselves up after the huge thing that was colonialism. So this is the end of the first session. It has been quite a long session. We'll talk about more relevant things in the second session involving economics, and in the third session we'll talk about the conflicts which exist between India and China. This is supposed to be the Asian century. This is called as the Asian century. So these understanding where these two countries came from is very important. So thank you for watching.